With apologies to Costa Rica, the most surprising result of the group stage of Brazil 2014 was the downfall of Spain, who came into the tournament ranked number 1 in the world and as the defending World Cup champions. The Dutch defeat of Spain in the first game was not a thrilling victory on the odd goal. This was a thrashing. With 10 minutes left in the match, the commentators suggested that Spain had stopped playing defense 15 minutes prior, and attentive fans could see in the eyes of Spanish players that there was some truth in this statement. So what happened? The commentators surmised that maybe this golden generation of Spanish players had suddenly passed their prime. And this theory was given further support by Spain's disappointing performance against Chile, which ended Spain's hope of advancing to the knockout stage. But I'm not convinced that a generation of Spanish players had suddenly grown old or lost their hunger to win, or that the world had finally cracked the Spanish tactical code. And tossing aside any conspiracy theories involving international intrigue and match fixing, we need to look for another explanation. And I think the explanation is this. The Spanish side is full of humans who were not mentally prepared to play the hand that they were dealt. The defending champs were ranked number 1 in the world and had every reason to enter the tournament confident. For Spain, the match against the Netherlands started as planned, and the individual and team skills of the Spanish were on full display. The Spanish scored first on Alonso's penalty kick, which was preceded by a controversial call in the 27th minute. Conventional wisdom would have suggested that the Spanish would have been able to transition into a possession style of play and run out the clock for the next 60 minutes as they had previously. And the commentators would have been free to proceed with the ubiquitous narrative that at this level of play, one mistake is the difference maker. But then, in the 44th minute, Robin van Persie scored his improbable Flying Dutchman goal. The Spanish were understandably disappointed, and perhaps a bit surprised, maybe even shocked, having grown used to clean sheets and relatively easy defeats in international play. After all, Spain only conceded 2 goals in the 7 games it took to win the World Cup in 2010. But then in the 53rd minute, Robin added a second goal with a clever bit of individual play in front of the Spanish net. The second goal came as a jolt to Spain and changed the tone of the game. What the Dutch gained, the Spanish lost. The goal gave the Netherlands the lead and turned Spanish disappointment into Spanish disorientation, which ushered in additional mistakes and led to a spirit of surrender long before the final whistle blew. Had that second goal not occurred, I don't believe this 3rd, 4th, or 5th goal would have occurred either. Van Persie's Flying Dutchman goal was almost miraculous, and Robin's follow-up was impressive as well. But the 3rd goal was made possible by an unfocused defense on a set piece, and the 4th goal was made possible by an even greater mental lapse by a normally world-class keeper who was only physically on the field at the time, and it was clear to any attentive viewer that he was somewhere else mentally. Spain's match against Netherlands and their follow-up against Chile is a great conversation piece for understanding the psychology of sport performance, because it's in the blowouts that we see most clearly the positive and the negative side of the mental game. And the psychology of sport performance is very much the same for world-class athletes as it is for the rest of us. Great performers are human beings too. They just do things more quickly and tend to make less mistakes. But every human being, no matter their skill level or no matter their sport, feels better when they succeed and feels worse when they fail. And this is a key to sports psychology. So let's look at Spain's match against the Netherlands. That first goal in the 27th minute was exciting for Spain. And like their supporters, the Spanish players were pleased. When athletes are pleased, they tend to become more focused, confident, and motivated to perform. While tactically, managers might train their players to play a more conservative possession style of play after a goal is scored, the players want more. The thirst of a champion is not satisfied by a single success, as the Dutch so unmercifully demonstrated in their match against Spain. Success usually promotes focus because athletes don't expend their mental energy trying to make sense of their successes the way they try to make sense of their failures. So after their first goal, Spain was likely in a good place mentally, confident in their chances, but realistic about what lay before them for the next 63 minutes. Meanwhile, the Dutch were obviously a bit frustrated after Alonso's goal, especially since they didn't feel that the foul was warranted. But they didn't panic and they continued to play with resolve. The Netherlands' frustration turned to joy in the 44th minute with Van Persie's Flying Dutchman goal, which sent the Netherlands into halftime pleased with their performance thus far. Shortly after half, in the 53rd minute, Robben's goal put the Netherlands ahead and perhaps exposed some weaknesses in the Spanish defense. And this goal energized the Dutch and disoriented the Spanish. It was obvious the Spanish were trying to make sense of what was happening. When mistakes pile up, athletes tend to get focused on the past and the future and tend to pay less attention to the present. So it would not be surprising if many of the Spanish players were a bit preoccupied with mistakes that they or their teammates had made, which allowed 2 goals to be scored, but also worried about what these goals might mean for their chances of winning the game and getting through to the last 16, and what team failure might mean for their own prospects. And this preoccupation phase is associated with decreases in confidence and lapses in focus. It is not as if the athletes are not concentrating, it is just that they are not concentrating on the right things. Instead, they're concentrating on the wrong things, the subjective past and the future, rather than the objective present. And when athletes are not focused on the ball, their teammates, their opponents, their duties, and the things that matter at the moment, they are much more likely to make additional mistakes. By the 65th minute, the Spanish players seemed completely preoccupied and disoriented, which caused them to make uncharacteristic mistakes that turned Dutch dominance into a Spanish shocker. And that is why, by the 80th minute, the commentators observed that the Spanish had stopped playing defense 15 minutes prior. Because they had. Again, when athletes are preoccupied with the past and the future, they tend to make more mistakes in the present. And in this incredibly stressful state of mind, they are close to the edge. And at some point, most will jump off. They give up. They dial out. Now, they don't literally quit by leaving the pitch physically, but when athletes dial out, they leave the game mentally because they have lost hope in performing as they had hoped. In tennis, this is called tanking, and it happens even at the highest levels. When players give up hope, they often play carelessly to expedite a seemingly inevitable result so that they can get out of such a stressful situation more quickly. But while the second half saw Spanish disappointment turn to disorientation and then defeat, the Dutch provided a glimpse at the other side of the performance dial. Each time the Dutch scored a goal, their confidence increased, their focus narrowed, and their motivation grew into a voracious appetite for more. If you happen to have recorded the match between the Dutch and the Spanish, rewatch the match, and especially the moments after each goal was scored. Notice the looks in their eye, notice their posture, pay attention to their energy, while the Spanish players became increasingly demoralized. the Dutch players were energized. After the first goal, they were pleased but cautious. Second, even happier. The third, you started to see the energy build. The energized phase is a product of prior successes. When athletes succeed, they feel better. They're initially pleased, and when these successes accumulate, they feel energized. Despite the heat and humidity in Brazil, the Dutch players showed energy well into stoppage time with a 4-goal lead. And some athletes sometimes will report this feeling of being dialed in, like everything is going right. Sometimes we call this being in the zone or flow, but it's a state in which things are happening automatically. Players feel so confident that they feel that they can't even fail, that they are not doing it, it's just happening. Almost an out-of-body experience. I have no idea if any of the Dutch players dialed in during their match against Spain, but it's clear that most of the Dutch players spent the greater part of the second half on the right side of the performance dial. To try to make sense of this shocking defeat, the commentators suggested that this generation of Spanish players had suddenly grown old, or maybe they'd lost their hunger to succeed, or perhaps the rest of the world had finally cracked the code to understanding the Spanish style of play. It was clear that they had given up during their match against the Netherlands, progressing from frustrated to preoccupied to dialing out completely. If you don't believe me, rewatch the match. Look at Casillas' eyes after the third, fourth, and fifth goals. Look at his posture and body language. Look at that of the other players, especially the defensive players. So going into the match against Chile, they were vulnerable and apparently hadn't completely dealt with the mistakes made during their match against the Netherlands. And that's why it really only took the first goal against Chile to get many of the players near the line where they would give up. They were preoccupied with their failure and vulnerable to crossing the line and dialing out. The performance style summarizes how athletes tend to respond to success and failure throughout a competition. But failure does not necessarily need to push an athlete towards frustration, preoccupation, and finally dialing out. It usually does, unless an athlete is mentally tough enough to intervene. Our bodies are amazing. They do so many things for us without our intervention. Consider your breathing. For the last few minutes, you've been breathing, and you haven't even had to think about it, because your body is set up to do that automatically. And just like breathing happens automatically, so does our automatic response to success and failure, unless we are intentional about intervening. And what's amazing about our minds is they can take control of our bodies if we make that decision. If you want to, you can take a deep breath. And another, and you'll find relaxation. Or you can breathe more shallow and quicker and pump yourself up. But if you aren't intentional about your breathing won't work for you, and in some cases might work against you. And that's what happens with our automatic response to success and failure. If we are not intentional about it, our psychological response to failure will work against us and make it more likely that we will fail again. But we have the free will to take control and to disregard the failures so that we don't progress from frustration to preoccupation to the point where we would dial out and give up. And this is one way to think about mental toughness. Mentally tough athletes are those who are able to disregard failure, which would naturally frustrate them, cause them to be preoccupied with making sense of why the failure occurred and what the failure means for their future, and eventually dialing out and giving up hope that they can perform as they had hoped. And this is part of what sports psychology is all about, helping strengthen athletes' minds so they are mentally tough. And that's part of what I do as a sports psychologist, helping athletes work out their mental muscles to prepare to reach their potential on and off the field.